Matthew chapter 5, I'm going to begin reading in verse 38. I'm reading from the New International Version. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you. Do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect. The Greek word there means to be complete, fully sufficient. That's another way of saying be completely at peace or content. Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. I want to talk a little bit at the beginning of the power of human imagination. It's amazing the way in which humans are able to see something, and once we can imagine it, how almost unlimited our ability to achieve what we imagine really is. You and I have to be able to imagine the world Jesus is describing if we have any chance of living into it, and that's one of the great blessings of the ministry of Jesus. He tells us of a world we have no access to. You and I, when we study the world, when we try to navigate our way through it, we're looking at a broken and corrupted model. We have no access to Eden before the fall. We don't know what the relationships between animals and humans were prior to that. We don't know how the ecosystems work. We don't know how the laws of nature worked. We just don't have access to any of those things. It's a world in many ways opposed to the rulership of God, and you and I trying to submit to him and yet negotiate with this world as it is. It's a complicated thing. What would the world look like if God was in charge, if Jesus was on the throne, if the people of the earth shared one language like they did before Babel, if there was no racism, if there was no prejudice, if there was no stranger danger? What would it be like? We don't even know, right? Can we even imagine? That's not the world. And yet Jesus comes in the Sermon on the Mount and he says, that is the world. That was the world, and it will be it again. You're living in a temporary, broken, and fractured world that is marred by things I didn't want to be a part of it. So let me tell you what the world was really meant to look like, and maybe you can trust me to lead you into it. That's the Sermon on the Mount. But we have to imagine it first. Imagination is a powerful and unique gift given to humans. Jesus has been telling us what the real world looks like. And we don't hear him because we think he's describing a fake world, that we're actually living in the real world. You're asleep. The world you're living in is a broken fiction. The Sermon on the Mount describes the world as it is, as it was intended to be, and as it will be forever. And when you and I read it, and we feel the disconnect, and we feel the panic, and we feel the guilt, what we're feeling is the sense of waking up. And we don't want to wake from our dream, as wicked as it is, because once we're awake, we're responsible. It's so pivotally important, though, that we don't think Jesus is writing rules that will change this place. He's describing a reality that will replace this place. He's not writing rules that will fix this world. He is describing a reality that will replace this world. And the citizens of the kingdom are invited to begin to live into its values long before it arrives. That has been the last 2,000 years. In Matthew 5, 21 to 26, Jesus asked us to imagine living without wrath. Can you imagine that? In verses 27 to 37, he asked us to imagine a way of life in which our eyes, our homes, and our speech are safe for the people around us. Can you imagine that? And today in verses 38 to 48, he's asked us to imagine living without two foundational aspects of human life in this reality: fear and vengeance. Imagine living without fear and without vengeance. Look back at verse 38 of Matthew chapter 5. You've heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. So this is from the law of Moses. This is one of God's requirements in the covenant of Sinai, and it's a really important correction. Like I've been saying, the law is the first step to holiness. It's not the full step or the complete step. It's just the first step, but it's an important first step. In the ancient world, things had a way of escalating. You steal from me, I punch you in the eye. You punch me back, I cut off your hand. You cut off my leg, I shoot you in the face. This is the way it goes, right? They have guns, but maybe a slingshot, I don't know. Things have a way of escalating like that in human societies where we always want to one-up. And so the law of Moses kind of nipped that in the bud by saying you're not allowed to retaliate beyond the harm done to you. It's important, and Jesus is not saying, don't worry about that anymore. Escalate all you want. The kingdom's coming. He's not doing that, right? The law of Moses is still in effect. That's still where you start. Let's start out, folks, by not doing worse to somebody than they did to us. How about that? So you've heard that it was said eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. And the moment you hear that, you go, whoa, Jesus, I'm not into the doormat theology. But Jesus is saying that the law of not over-retaliating was actually pointed to a place in which you gave evil so little concern you didn't even give them a second. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. This is an insulting thing in the ancient world. I think it's insulting here too. I never had a church person literally slap me in the face, but I imagine it would embarrass me. And it certainly embarrassed people in the ancient world. But it was, at least if it was the right hand, that's the social hand, the clean hand. But turn to him the other one also. Don't worry about being insulted, is what Jesus is saying. Just let it go. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. He's already dealt with this. If you're in trouble with somebody and you can't get it made at peace before you go to the government, settle your matters before you get to the court. He's already said that. This is one of the things he's kind of fleshing out. He's saying, if somebody sues you, they want to take your shirt, give them a little more than they're asking, maybe you can avoid the court thing. Don't worry about defending yourself. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. This is government oppression. In the ancient world, the only ones who could do this, as far as our historical records tell us, are Roman soldiers. They were allowed to force somebody to carry all their gear for 1 mile. They weren't allowed to go further than that. Jesus says, well, the law requires you to carry the gear 1 mile, carry it 2. Give to the one who asks you. Don't turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Jesus is describing a kingdom that clearly does not exist, right? You don't live in this world. We have to be careful that we don't build this into a list of rules, that we don't call a disciplinary committee of the church to call in all the people in the congregation who said no to a request. What Jesus is describing is a kingdom that's coming, a sphere of living in which we can set aside our fear. Because all of these, when you were reading those, when you were hearing them read, if you were really thinking about them, think about the thing that keeps you from doing all these things. It's almost always fear. Being disrespected is an assault. We're afraid other people will believe that. I need to defend my reputation. What if people believe that? What's going to happen to me? That's fear. If a government oppresses you and tells you you have to do something you don't want to do, that's an assault that you'd rather not have to endure. So you protect yourself and you don't want to do that. You don't want to hear what Jesus is saying. When somebody asks for something from you, you don't want to lend it to them because then you won't have enough for yourself maybe, or you won't get it back in the same condition. You may not be able to afford to replace it, whatever else. You're afraid. Jesus is asking us to imagine a world in which we don't need to fear those things. Not because the people are good, but because you're different and because God is caring for you. Walter Brueggemann wrote an essay some years ago called The Myth of Scarcity and the Liturgy of Abundance. And what he was talking about there is that most of us in the world live under a story of scarcity. You can see it in a pie chart sometimes when you watch the news. There's supposedly only so much in the world, food, money, wealth, metals, whatever in the world you're doing. And if I have half of it, then there's only 50% left for everybody else to share. It's the myth of the oranges. If you've got 5 oranges and 100 people, and you give one orange to one of those people, now the other 99 only have 4 to share, right? That's the story we live in. We all know that's true. That's just common sense. But Brueggemann calls that the myth of scarcity. You don't really live in that world. I mean, it looks like you live in that world. You experience that world every day, but you're wrong about it. That's not the world we live in. How do I know? Because we live in a world with a God. That is an atheist world. That is an atheist world. That is a world that is a closed system with no one who can smuggle anything in outside of it. But we serve a God who, when Jesus was in the wilderness, he was able to pull bread right out of the heavens and feed 5,000 people. God was able to deliver manna to the people in the wilderness for 40 years right out of the heavens. It was not in the world until God put it in, which means there's no way for Christians to estimate how much is in the world because the source of everything in it is outside of it and can smuggle in whatever he wants whenever he wants to. Now, the fact that he doesn't often do it, or the fact that we don't see him doing it, maybe is a problem for us. But let me give you a line of sight on something God is doing every day. Energy. Actually, the Bible calls what we call energy in science, the Bible calls spirit, and that spirit is constantly sourced by God. It's constantly being smuggled in from outside. What Brueggemann says is that the true story of creation is the liturgy of abundance. That in reality, humanity had nothing to fear because all of our needs were sourced in a God who was without limit. The only reason that the myth of scarcity has taken over is because of our distance from that God, because we are strangulating the source of our life with our sin and our refusal to follow him. And so the more creation distances itself from God, the less access it is allowed to have to God's smuggling in of things from outside the system. The reason that we are being strangulated is the same reason that if you cut a tree off of the root, like if you trim your trees and you take that, the leaves stay green for a while, right? But in the end, all of those leaves are now feeding off an ever-diminishing source of life, right? The sap is now drying up, the life-giving energy is zapping away, and eventually that branch is going to die. That's the world you live in. That's why it looks like we have scarcity everywhere, because as we cut ourselves off from the source of life, there's no new sap being fed into the system. And so we are now fighting over the last bits of sap, and the leaves are withering on the tree. That's the world you and I live in, but that's not the world as it should be. It's not the world as it was intended. And for Christians, as we get reconnected to Jesus, it's not our experience. Now, that is not to say that you're going to get everything you want, because we do live in a broken world, but it does mean we serve a God who can intervene at any time to bring something into the world that's not there. Jesus is a sign of this. The virgin birth is a sign of this. Miracles are just signs of this. That there's a world that's coming that will be so connected to its source that there'll be no fear that if I give, I won't have. Can you imagine living in a world like that? The truth is, you're already following the God that created all of this into a world like that, so maybe we should start practicing living that way today. Maybe rather, if somebody asks me for something and I don't have it because I have to feed my family, that's one thing. But if I saved it away for my retirement and somebody needs it now, maybe I trust that God will provide for me if I meet this need. That's a little bit of how we practice living in the kingdom that's not here yet. You can't fully live in it. You will probably starve to death because the world is broken. But you can start living into it. You can start releasing some of it. And you can start realizing that your fear is only a consequence of your disconnect from God. The closer you get to him, the less you have to fear. And the more we follow Jesus into the new kingdom, the more fear is an irrelevant concern when it comes to our own well-being. Can you follow him? Generosity is something that is either a part of who you're living into or it's not. It doesn't matter how much money you have, it won't change it. So what Jesus is saying in this first part is if we are insulted, don't fear, God will take up your cause. If you're sued, don't fear, God will provide for your needs. If you're oppressed, don't fear, the Lord will provide you strength to endure beyond what is asked. If we give away our hoarded resources, don't fear, our Father in the heavens will care for us. How much would your life change if you really believed that? Imagine living life without vengeance, without the desire to see someone suffer for the bad they've done to me. Look at verse 43. You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor, hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who, that you may be children of your Father in the heavens. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be complete. Be content. That's what perfect means there. Have everything you need, therefore, as your heavenly Father has everything he needs. You see the irony there? You might think, man, Jesus wants me to be perfect. What a drag. But that's not what he's talking about. He's saying, live as though you have everything that you need and you'll be just like God. Live as though you already have everything that you need. Be perfect. And you'll be like God. Can you imagine living like right now what you have is all you need? Now, it's easy for someone who has to say that. There are always going to be people in our communities that need help. It's not a judgment against them, but it is an awareness that we already, probably most of us, have all that we need for the happiness we think one more check will buy us. That's what he means by be perfect. Now, when Jesus tells us to love our enemies, I want to clarify what he's talking about there. So in English, love and hate are very emotional terms, right? What do I mean when I say I love you or I love ice cream? Am I saying the same thing in all those cases? Probably not, right? It's a very flexible word. Love in the Bible is about loyalty. It's about faithfulness. It's about sticking with something. It's loyalty, and there's an emotional part of loyalty, but it's not primarily emotional. So when God says he loves you, he's not saying he likes you. That's very important that you understand. When the scriptures say God loves you, he's not saying he likes you or he's happy with who you are. That's just not in that word. There are other ways of saying that. What he's saying is, I'm loyal to you. No matter what you do to me, I'm loyal to you. That's what he means when he says he loves you. So for God's loved the world in this way, that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him might not perish, but have everlasting life. That's John 3:16, right? It's not saying God felt such affection for the world, or God was so passionately desirous of the world, or God was so fond of the world. He's not saying any of those things. This is not written in English, even though I know in the movies Jesus speaks with an English accent. It was written in Greek and Hebrew, and the word there means that God showed his loyalty to the disloyal people of the earth by dying for them. That's what the text is saying. If you want to know how loyal God is to you, look at the cross. If you want to know what God thinks of your behavior, well, you might want to read some other passages. Hate also is not primarily an emotional term. We use hate the way that the old word loathe was used. It's just like this intense, we even say it, hatred for something. But hate in the Bible is about disloyalty. So you read the verse in Malachi that says, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. You remember that verse? And you might go, wow, that's terrible for Esau. What would it be like to have God look at him and go, But that's not what it's talking about at all. God is just simply saying, I chose to be loyal to Jacob and I did not choose to be loyal to Esau. That's what he's saying. And we know that's true because Esau is not chosen. But by the grace of God, Esau too can be saved if they're grafted into Israel, which is what the book of Obadiah is all about. So it's not as though Esau is cast aside. They just can't be first. Israel's first, and that's what he means. He chose loyalty to Israel, and through that loyalty, bring other people in. But Esau doesn't get, if God has to choose between Israel and Esau in the First Testament, he's going to choose Israel because Esau's salvation depends on them. That's what he's talking about there. So hate is about who you're loyal to. Shaneh is the word in Hebrew. So love and hate in the scriptures are not so much about emotions. What Jesus is saying, let me paraphrase the verses we read together here. Imagine a world in which you don't show loyalty only to those for whom you care and who care for you. Imagine showing loyalty to people who are not your children or your spouse or your family or your friends. Imagine showing loyalty to people that do not show loyalty to you. Imagine that. Love your enemies is the other way of saying that. Imagine showing loyalty to people who don't show loyalty to you. Imagine that. Imagine a world in which you were loyal to those who are disloyal to you. Imagine a world in which you respect those who disrespect you. Can you imagine living with the best interest of all people in your heart as opposed to the best interest only of those who benefit you in some way? Can you imagine that? Jesus is saying, the world that's coming is different. You won't have to cordon yourself off in that way. You won't have to just be loyal to, you won't have to put your family first. You'll be able to show loyalty to even to people who are disloyal to you. You'll be able to be respectful to someone who talks about you behind your back, spreads gossipy rumors about you. You'll be able to, that's the kingdom. The demand for loyalty and respect and the penalties we exact from those who are disloyal have a way of escalating and enslaving us. And Jesus is saying we can be free of that. He's not taught us that we shouldn't want justice. Of course we do. Governments have been tasked with the responsibility of maintaining a level of justice and security in the world. But the truth is, no government is going to give you true justice, and if you're looking for that, you're going to miss the kingdom. For those of us who believe that there's a God in the heavens who is just, who knows the deepest recesses of every human heart, who is going to judge all the earth and no one's going to get away with anything, we can release our demand for justice and vengeance and trust that God will make things right. We can do that. Jesus has asked us to imagine a world in which God really exists. But if we really believe that there was a God in the heavens who could bring bread out of the heavens, who could care for us, who is on the throne, who will bring justice, who will not allow gossip to go unanswered. If we really believed that, it would change our lives in such fundamental ways we wouldn't even recognize who we were tomorrow. This is what Jesus is inviting us to believe, to imagine. We used to sing a song. We used to sing it all the time in the church I grew up in. It was the song, He Giveth More Grace. The lyrics are these: He giveth more grace when the burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength when the labors increase. To added affliction, He addeth His mercy. To multiplied trials, His multiplied peace. His love has no limit. His grace has no measure. His power has no boundary known unto men. For out of His infinite riches in Jesus, He giveth and giveth and giveth again. When we have exhausted our store of endurance, when our strength has failed ere the day is half done, when we reach the end of our hoarded resources, our Father's full giving has only begun. The challenge for us, church, as we read through the Sermon on the Mount, and this is just an example of it in these verses, is, do you believe that? And if you do, Jesus invites you to live like it's true.